In the international press, you'll hear Amsterdam referred to as the world's cycling city. A bicycle paradise where carefree cyclists cruise down velvety smooth red asphalt with the wind in their hair. Well, except those cranky people in Copenhagen, but I already made a video about that. Of course, if you ask almost anyone who lives elsewhere in the Netherlands, they'll say you will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. That Amsterdam is the worst place in the Netherlands, nay, the world, to ride a bicycle. So to settle this, I decided to track down the worst places to cycle in Amsterdam. I have my own least favorite places, but I also asked online for other people's opinions. And I asked the Dutch cycling advocacy organization, the Fietsersbond, for their list as well. I'm mostly going to focus on poor infrastructure here, but I'll talk a little bit about places that are terrible for other reasons as well. And to my viewers in the Netherlands, I apologize in advance for the Dutch street names I will mispronounce in this video. The first thing that's interesting to note is what areas are not included: the suburbs. Unlike cities in almost every other country, the suburbs of Amsterdam are quite pleasant for cycling. It's typical to find wide cycle paths, and in general, cycling is very comfortable. This makes sense because the suburbs were designed in the era of the car, so there's plenty of space for wide bicycle lanes and protected intersections. In other cities, it was always frustrating to me that cycling was seen as a downtown thing, when really the suburbs have plenty of room and are the easiest place to build a great cycling network. But getting back to the bad parts, it's worth differentiating between uncomfortable and dangerous. There are several places that are uncomfortable to cycle in Amsterdam, usually because it's too crowded. A great example of this is Kinkerstraat, where on the south side there is a narrow bicycle path with columns on one side and parked bicycles on the other. Fortunately, in the opposite direction, a car lane has been removed, so the other side of the street is much better. Another example that several people gave me is Overtoom, a street in Oud-West, and part of the hoofdnet auto, a major route for cars. If you don't know what a hoofdnet is, it's basically a network that prioritizes one type of traffic over the others. To learn more, you can watch my video about invisible infrastructure that I'll link to here and in the description. Despite the fact that Overtoom prioritizes cars, it has protected bicycle paths that would make any American jealous. But although this infrastructure is great, it's not wide enough to meet demand. When the sidewalks get crowded and parked bicycles overflow into the fietspad, it can be difficult to cycle here when it's busy. Though during the current coronavirus restrictions, it's been okay. I'm sure my international viewers are thinking only the Dutch would complain about this cycle path not being good enough. Centurbaan in De Pijp is another example of the same problem. But since it's not part of the hoofdnet auto, there may be hope of restricting cars here someday. Another uncomfortable place to cycle is the Inner Canal Ring, the oldest part of the city and the place with all the tourists. Though since the coronavirus travel restrictions, it's actually quite pleasant to cycle here. For now. One interesting infrastructure quirk in the center is these contraflow bicycle lanes found in two places in the Inner Canal Ring. One on Spiegelgracht and the other down the street at Herengracht. Tourists constantly mistake them for sidewalks. An American tourist once yelled at me for riding here while she was walking along it. I always think of this incident when people come back from Amsterdam complaining that cyclists are out of control and riding on the sidewalk. I think it's more likely those tourists just don't know the difference between a sidewalk and a fietspad. But these are the uncomfortable places. They're not always the most enjoyable places to ride, but they're not exactly dangerous. So where is the worst infrastructure in Amsterdam? Here's one example that was given to me, Javastraat. This street has been called an absolute shit show, and I think that's a pretty good description. It is a very busy shopping street with lots of drivers pulling in and out of parking spots, competing with dozens of delivery drivers. On Javastraat, it seems like every delivery van permanently drives with their hazard lights on. Traffic is two-way here, and because in the Netherlands, any street with a speed limit of 30 km per hour does not require bicycle infrastructure. So all traffic is mixed, and cyclists need to dodge cars and delivery vehicles as they ride. The best solution here would be to pedestrianize the street, and this would allow more space for shoppers on the crowded sidewalks. Delivery vehicles would still be permitted, of course, but removing personal vehicles would free up a lot of space for all of the important things that need to happen on this street. Alternatively, the street could be made one way for motor vehicle traffic. A good example of this is Haarlemmerdijk, which was a very congested shopping street in the 1970s, but is much more pleasant today. Another bad street is Stadhouderskade, also known as the S100. This is a major car street that forms a ring around the city center. Parts of this street have separated bicycle paths that are decent, though often too narrow, but other parts dump you right into the street in a painted bicycle gutter. One particularly bad area is this place by Vondelpark. The street widens into multiple lanes for cars to allow for turn lanes, and the cycle path is far too narrow. There are these red markers identifying the separation between the cycle path and the sidewalk, but during the tourist season, this area becomes almost impassable by bicycle. As you follow the S100 around the city, it changes names to Nassaukade, where you're again dumped into a painted bicycle gutter next to angled car parking. I remember the first time I ever cycled in Amsterdam, I ended up here, next to high-speed car traffic, and was amazed that such streets still existed in bicycle-friendly Amsterdam. What I didn't realize, as a tourist, is that if you find yourself on a street like Nassaukade, you're probably in the wrong place. I've since learned that all the locals are one street over, on Marnixstraat. This is a street where through traffic by car is not permitted, so car traffic volumes are extremely low, and cycling can be quite pleasant. That is, with one exception, which is at the intersection of our next problem street, Rozengracht. This intersection is a mix of far too much traffic. There are lots of cars and bicycles and even a few tram lines that turn in different directions here. The Rozengracht itself is a rather unpleasant place to cycle too, another street with a painted line next to parked cars. Though on this particular day, this delivery driver decided to block the road rather than the bike lane, which was nice for a change. A little farther to the east, Rozengracht turns into Radhoustraat, a very unpleasant street for cycling in the city center, and I'm very glad that I'm done trying to pronounce the word gracht. This is another street without bicycle infrastructure, but the problem here is that this is one of the main routes that drivers take out of the city center heading west. This makes car volumes higher than most other streets in the area, and it really makes you notice the lack of infrastructure. The parked cars don't help here either. There are still a few large roads in Amsterdam without any protected bicycle infrastructure. Many of these streets have limited traffic, which makes conflict less likely, but they're still not very much fun to cycle on sometimes. A good example is Churchill-laan, a 1920s-era street with parked cars. This is technically part of the hoofdnet fiets that should prioritize cycling, but you'd never guess it, and the painted bicycle lane leads to totally predictable results. Thankfully, after a few blocks, it leads to a street like this. A more problematic street nearby is Van Wouwstraat. This is technically a 30 km/h street, but there isn't really much in the design that enforces that speed. This street is much busier than the previous streets I've shown and typically has a lot of car traffic, at least by Amsterdam standards. This is technically another part of the hoofdnet fiets, so it gets a lot of bicycle traffic as well, and of course, there's a tram line too. Honestly, this street is a mess. It's busy and crowded, and sometimes you're squeezed between parked cars and tram tracks, which can be quite dangerous. And when you design a mixed street to be car-friendly like this, it inevitably makes drivers think they own the road, and they feel justified honking at cyclists who are in their way. It reminds me of so many streets you find in Toronto, so if I ever get homesick for Canada, I just come out and cycle in Van Wouwstraat. And I'm not homesick anymore. Another similar street is Zijlstraat. Part of the problem here is that this is one of the only ways to cross the river here, at Zijlbrug, so it's busy with all kinds of traffic. I absolutely hate coming here, especially in rush hour, as it's such an absolute mess of a street. But again, the thing with Amsterdam is that if you're cycling here, you're probably in the wrong place. About 400 meters to the north is this bridge, which is only for walking and cycling. This is an extremely pleasant place to cycle, and it leads directly into Vondelpark. So if you have a choice, you should always cycle this way and avoid crossing at Zeilbrugge. So that's my list, but if you think I missed a particularly bad street, please let me know in the comments. And of course, dangerous is always a relative statement. This is a new bicycle lane built to the latest design standards in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, where I went to university. I can guarantee you won't ever see me cycling here. So in the end, is Amsterdam really the worst or the best place to cycle? Well, I think it's more accurate to say that Amsterdam is a work in progress. For example, this is a beautiful separated bicycle lane, meeting the latest bicycle design standards, and I use it on a fairly regular basis. But until last year, it looked like this: a painted bicycle gutter along a major road for cars. This painted line bike lane, along a bridge in Amsterdam, was installed in 1982. But just 2 years later, the Fietsersbond had to fight and hold protests because the city wanted to remove it and give the space back to drivers. Today, of course, it's a curb-separated bicycle lane. The lesson here is that you can't change a city overnight, and even Amsterdam usually waits until a road is due for resurfacing before major changes are made, about every 30 years or so. But this is why good quality bicycle infrastructure design standards are important, or else you'll end up building stuff like this for the next 30 years instead. In the 1980s, Amsterdam cycling advocates were still fighting for painted bicycle infrastructure, just like your city is probably doing today. This means there's still a lot of old streets that are overdue for a change, and that means you can sometimes end up cycling in places like this. The good news is that with every street redesign, things generally become better. Problem spots usually get improved, though sometimes it still requires the advocacy work of organizations like the Fietsersbond, even today. It also provides some hope for other cities around the world, because they're similar to what Amsterdam used to be not too long ago. They're just about 30 years behind schedule. I'd like to thank my supporters on Patreon who pay me to complain about Amsterdam for a change. If you'd like to support the channel and get access to bonus videos, visit patreon.com/notjustbikes.